450 years ago, there was a Unitarian king. His name was John Sigismund Zapolya, and he was king of Hungary in the province of Transylvania that is now part of Romania. With the Protestant Reformation underway in Europe, and guided by his physician, Giorgio Biandrata, and the court preacher, Ferenc David, John organized a series of theological debates in the 1560s. Informed by these debates, the king converted from Catholicism to Lutheranism in 1562, and from Lutheranism to Calvinism in 1564. In 1568, John issued the Edict of Torda, giving religious freedom to Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, and Unitarian churches. And he himself converted to Unitarianism when David won a debate against a Trinitarian. What a story, right? How cool is it that we had a Unitarian king? And we can boast that we were part of the first act of religious freedom in the Western world, and as far back as the 16th century, no less. Of course, and unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. History is not a linear progression of things always getting better. In 1570, a long-standing conflict with the Habsburgs of Austria was resolved on the condition that John renounce his claim to the Hungarian throne, taking the title Prince of Transylvania instead. And having been ill for much of his short life, John died the following year. And the Transylvanians elected István Báthory, who was Catholic, to succeed him. Báthory tried to undermine the Edict of Torda, which otherwise remained in effect, and subsequently issued a new decree that prohibited further religious innovation. In other words, there was still official recognition of the Catholic, Lutheran, Calvinist, and Unitarian churches, and nobody could be forced to convert from one to another, but that was it. No more theological debates, no more new ideas. Well, guess which one of those four denominations was wanting to entertain some new ideas? Ferenc David had been John's court preacher, remember, and he himself had followed a similar religious journey to that on which he had led John. David is in fact the only person to have ever been raised Catholic, ordained a Catholic priest, converted to Lutheranism, made a Lutheran bishop, converted to Calvinism, elected a Calvinist bishop, and finally converted to Unitarianism. What's more, he's considered the first in the line of Transylvanian Unitarian bishops. Yes, there are Unitarian bishops in Eastern Europe. In converting to Unitarianism, David was certainly influenced by John's physician, Giorgio Biandrata, who was born in Italy, argued with Calvin in Geneva, and became a Unitarian in Poland before finding his way to Transylvania. David and Biandrata collaborated on theological matters and even wrote a book together, The False and True Knowledge of God. But after John's death and Báthory's prohibition of religious innovation, they had a falling out. Biandrata continued as Báthory's physician and was content to live within the new restrictions in order to protect Unitarianism and preserve it for the future. David was no longer court preacher, of course, but with his congregation, he was raising religious questions, particularly about the relationship of Unitarianism to Christianity. Biandrata asked David to stop it, but he didn't. Biandrata even brought in the influential leader of the Polish Unitarians to try to convince David of the error of his ways, but that didn't work either. Biandrata accused David of breaking an agreement, and after that, there was only animosity between them. When Bathory put David on trial, Biandrata led the prosecution. David was ill and weak. The conviction was a foregone conclusion, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. David died a few months later. As UU historian Charles Howe notes, controversy over the trial began at once and has continued down through the years. On the one hand, David was evidently convinced that doctrinal reform was too important. Confident in the rightness of his cause, neither a law nor an agreement deterred him. Biandrata, on the other hand, having failed to dissuade David from his dangerous course, apparently felt it necessary to turn against his friend in order to save the Unitarian movement from destruction. Howe goes on to note that most Unitarians in Transylvania, then and now, have taken David's side and roundly denounced Biandrata's actions. I would say that the same is true for most Unitarian Universalists who know this story too. But it does highlight one of the eternal challenges of religion, a challenge that we must face in our own time too. Every social institution experiences a tension between two internal forces, namely progress and preservation. On the one hand, there are questions, curiosity, new ideas, new discoveries, different perspectives, and changing opinions. On the other hand, there is a desire to keep things stable, familiar, comfortable, and understandable. And for many people, a change to what they know can be unsettling, confusing, or even scary. Obviously, an institution that changes everything merely for the sake of change will soon cease to be that institution. But if nothing ever changes, then it becomes a fossil. There must be a balance between progress and preservation, between responding to changing people in a changing world and holding on to lasting values and what really matters. Unitarian Universalism is not immune to this challenge. On the one hand, our principles lift up the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Our sources name humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, warning us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. And the very first smooth stone of liberal religion is that there is no end to what we may learn. So while our theology is very open-ended and free-ranging, how we actually practice our religion, on the other hand, very often is not. UUs are just as likely to bring out the classic church excuses against change as anyone else, from "we've always done it this way and we can't afford it," to my personal favorite, "we tried it once and it didn't work." We like to talk about being free thinkers. Die Gedanken sind frei, as we sang a few weeks ago. But free thought doesn't just mean we don't think and do things the way most other people do. Rather, it means we're willing to change what we think and do based on new evidence and changing circumstances. When we refuse to change, in fact, we've usually fallen prey to one of those idolatries of the mind and spirit. Sometimes we have change thrust upon us whether we want it or not, whether we like it or not. That was certainly the case for churches everywhere last year, when, after ignoring for years the question of how to make services or other programs available online, whether streamed live or recorded and shared, the pandemic suddenly forced all of us at long last into the 21st century. Now, I know that while holding services and meeting online is functional, it's not the same as being in person. And there are some parts of being together physically that cannot be replicated virtually. I, for one, desperately miss congregational singing, though I also know that singing out loud in a group is one of the worst ways to spread virus-laden droplets and aerosols. There are also, however, benefits from being online, and one of the biggest is inclusion. People who are elderly or sick or who face other physical challenges, people who work on weekends, people who are out of the area, people who for whatever reason can't be in our building on a Sunday morning, all of them can still be participating members of our community when our open doors are virtual too. And that's the challenge we are facing right now, all of us, as we wait for the pandemic to end and pray for enough people to get vaccinated so that we're not at the mercy of Delta and other variants. That's the question we need to ask ourselves. What are we going to do with what we've learned during the last 16 months? We say that we want everything to go back to how it was before, but surely we don't mean to pretend that nothing changed, that when more than 500,000 Americans were dying, we didn't realize anything about what it means to be human, to be in community. As we ponder such questions, as we find ourselves impatiently hanging on news about case numbers and announcements from the CDC, we are in what is called a liminal state, what church consultant and spiritual director Susan Beaumont describes as neither here nor there, or perhaps already and not yet. The word liminal comes from the Latin word for threshold, the stone forming the base of a doorway that must be crossed to move from one space to another. As Beaumont notes in her book on the challenges of leadership at such a time, organizational life is full of liminal experiences, seasons where something has ended, but a new thing has not yet begun. Seasons where watching and waiting can be difficult, over-planning can be futile, and it simply isn't helpful to pretend that we understand what happens next. Liminal seasons are challenging, disorienting, and unsettling. We strive to move forward with purpose and uncertainty. Instead, we feel as though we are trudging through hot sand, moving away from something comfortable and known towards something that can't yet be known. I don't know of many people who would choose to be in a liminal state, and indeed the point isn't to stay there. Rather, liminality is about getting from one place to another. It's not easy and it's not a whole lot of fun, and there's such a temptation to turn around and go back to the comfort of familiarity rather than take the risk of going forward. One of the biggest stories of liminality in Western culture is that of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness for 40 years before finally reaching the promised land. Yes, they'd escaped from slavery in Egypt and had dramatically crossed the Red Sea, but it wasn't very long before they began grumbling about their journey. In Exodus chapter 16, the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." And in Numbers chapter 11, the Israelites also wept again and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt for nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there is nothing at all but this manna to look at." The complaining got so bad and the attempts to undermine Moses' leadership that God sent more than one fire to burn some of them, and another time the ground split open and swallowed up some of them. The point is, few people choose to be in a liminal state. It's tempting to go back to what we knew before, even if it wasn't so good. There will be complaints, and there may be people who try to exploit the situation. But sometimes there's no other way to get to where we really need to go. In June, I took an online course at Hartford Seminary, where 2 decades ago, I began my studies to prepare for the ministry. The course was entitled Religious Innovation. And noting that so many churches, no matter their vitality or lack thereof, had so quickly and successfully adapted to the realities of the pandemic, the professor of sociology of religion asked what we could learn about innovation and creativity in congregational life that could truly bring ministry into the 21st century. I audited the course along with 3 students taking it for credit and a couple of other auditors. And we had a wide-ranging discussion about our experiences, what our churches had been through during the pandemic, and what we could learn about religious innovation to help us move forward through this liminal season. Now, innovation is a hot topic in the business world, and certainly the language of customers and profits doesn't readily translate to religion, but there is a lot that does apply. For instance, there are 2 types of innovation, namely sustaining and disruptive. Sustaining innovation supports the status quo, making safe incremental changes, whereas disruptive innovation challenges the status quo and really shakes things up. Businesses and religions alike are generally afraid of disruptive innovation, but of course it's where the real progress happens. And in the course we noted, obviously, that plenty of disruption was already happening, thanks to 4 years of a disastrous, criminally incompetent, and just plain criminal presidency, capped off by the global pandemic. And that gives us plenty of fertile ground for innovation. Then there's the fact that in the business world, there's been a shift in recent years away from brands and towards products. As business professor and serial entrepreneur Scott Galloway explains in his book, Post-Corona, From Crisis to Opportunity, our culture is increasingly skeptical and has greater access to information than ever before. So it's no longer about whether we trust any given business or religion merely based on its name. Rather, it's about whether the products of that business or religion are any good. It's not about who we are, but about what we do. And that's really good news for Unitarian Universalism. We've struggled for decades to build up our brand, if you like, trying to explain our awkward 11-syllable mouthful of a name. But now what matters to the wider world is not our identity, but our mission. It's not about what we call ourselves, but about what difference we make in people's lives. And that should be a shoo-in for us. The course on religious innovation ended with each student, whether for credit or auditor, presenting what the professor called an innovative issue, something through which that student's religious community was working. Though it was the context for all of us, the transition back to in-person programming was on my mind because our transition task force was meeting a couple of times each week at the time. So my innovative issue concerned our Sunday mornings. After all, every Sunday morning, we have services, we have the forum, and we have RE classes for children and youth. On the one hand, A service with hymns and a sermon has long been the traditional center of a worshiping community. The forum is popular and has consistent and faithful participation. And we value our RE program with our UUFP vision saying that we want to be demographically diverse, supportive of families, and inclusive of children and youth. On the other hand, the format of our services is rooted in white Protestant practices that are challenged by our call to anti-racism. The forum didn't have the space to be truly open to the public in spite of its wider appeal. And Children's RE suffers from both our lack of space and the fact that the 1950s model of Sunday school is only getting less relevant as time goes on. The space issues, yes, we intend to address those with a bigger church building and more classrooms, but we can't just ignore them until we have that building. The fact is that almost all of our traditions have been disrupted. Our values are calling us to envision a future that works for everyone. And thankfully, there are no laws prohibiting religious innovation. The good news is that any time we have back in this building, once the Delta wave has passed and before this property is sold, any time we have here affords us the rare opportunity to play with some possibilities. As the Reverend Sean Neil Barron said in our reading today, the history of the church is the story of human enterprise, evolving in its sights and sounds, yet revolving always around its core. Our core is our mission to grow in wonder, connect in love, engage in service, and inspire generosity. But how we live that mission is as open to as many different ways as we can imagine. So the Transition Task Force is proposing, for instance, that once we're here in person again on Sunday mornings, the forum and the service keep the same schedule as they've had on Zoom for the last 16 months, with the forum at 9:30 and the service at 11. Since this sanctuary is being set up with cameras and screens to allow people to participate both in person and via Zoom, not only the service, but also the forum would take place here, taking some of the pressure off those people who, due to health conditions or age or other concerns, want to continue online for now, and also giving the forum room to grow. Joanne and I and some others have also been talking about possibilities for RE too, approaching this opportunity with open minds and a willingness to innovate in service to our mission. Though we've had it considerably easier than the Israelites did, we've been on our own journey through the wilderness during the liminal season of this pandemic. We want to go to the promised land, not back to Egypt, and we are getting there. Just look at all that we've done during this time. We've stayed together as a community. Our Sunday mornings and small group programs continued to meet our spiritual and emotional needs. We're in better financial health than ever. And we've made excellent progress on the commitment we made a year and a half ago to find a bigger church building more suitable to our mission. Just imagine what we could do next. The history of the church is the story of transformation. So let's cross this threshold and discover what happens next. May it be so.